Welcome to today's podcast. I'm Michael Levans, Group Editorial Director at Peerless Media's Supply Chain Group. And today we're talking about a shift that's quietly reshaping how transportation and logistics leaders operate. And that's the move from slow, cyclical planning to faster, more flexible, and continuously optimized networks. Now, after years of volatility, from capacity whiplash and cost spikes to changing freight patterns and tight service expectations that we're all feeling right now, many shippers are realizing that that old logistics playbook just isn't built for the environment that they're heading into here in 2026. So the pressure now isn't just to take cost out, it's to do it faster and to protect service at the same time, and of course, and to build real flexibility into how freight is planned, sourced, and executed. Now, to help us illustrate, what that new playbook actually looks like in practice, I'm joined by Steve Barber, and Steve is Vice President of Solutions Architecture at Uber Freight. Now, Steve works directly with shippers every day as they rethink network design, cost strategies, and how to really operate in a market that's becoming more dynamic and less forgiving, of slow decision making. Steve, welcome. We're thrilled you can join us today.
Really appreciate you having me, Michael. Thank you.
Outstanding. Steve, you're talking to shippers, large shippers every day, probably, right? As they head into 2026, what feels fundamentally different about their transportation and logistics priorities, compared to the past few years? What are you hearing there?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things. The main one, though, is that this mandate for flexibility, for cost out, and for service has become sharper.
Yeah.
Over the last few years, shippers have always cared about service. They've always said cost and service and flexibility are important to us. But now they're really being asked to do all three of them at the same time.
Right.
And there's a lot less room for error, as you mentioned. They're unable to pass some of these transportation expenses when they have an impact, whether it's a short-term or a longer-term impact, along to their customers or to their internal stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
And the service expectations are just getting harder. They haven't relaxed at all. And in fact, they're getting tougher in some markets and in some industries. And now, with the winter storms and with the changes in the regulatory environment, some of the other things that are going on, the market's starting to tighten again. And that little bit of pressure, when there's not as much flexibility in the marketplace, in the macro environment, is creating some real urgency. What I'm really hearing most often is we need to take out costs quickly. We can't break service, and we need to be able to adjust quickly when things are changing, as they are somewhat now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, that phrase, new logistics playbook, I mentioned it, you kind of touched on it there, Steve. It comes up a lot. And what actually is new about the playbook for 2026 versus, the one that shippers were using even, like 2 years ago? Is it coming down to that cost element you just mentioned there?
It is partly about cost, but some of it's just about the fact that it needs to move from this kind of episodic annual, maybe even biannual planning process to something that's more continuous. I think that 2 or 3 years ago, and even longer, this is the standard playbook has been, let's run a big periodic initiative. We're going to do an annual bid. We're going to do a large redesign of our network. We're going to do some kind of major sourcing event. Those still matter. Like, it's important to take those macro looks on a episodic basis, but they're not going to be enough to win in the short term, particularly as markets start to shift. Our playbook this year, that new logistics playbook, is really about layering in these continuous micro level adjustments on top of that larger strategy. We want to be constantly tuning lanes, regions, modes, and seasonality, and it's really balanced to keep cost and service in line as all the conditions change.
Yeah, right. So you're looking at sort of continuous optimization, right? So, Steve, to get there now, what do you think has driven that shift, or what's driving that shift? What risks are shippers, what are the risks for shippers that are still taking that, that slower approach? What's the shift, and what are some of the biggest risks?
Yeah, I think that some of it is that over the last couple of years, shippers have taken out some of the biggest, most obvious costs. They've had softness in the marketplace. They've had the opportunity for carriers to come in and reduce what I consider to be kind of routing guide or transactional costs. And then the other piece is that now budgets are getting pressure is becoming real.
Yep.
whether it's the regulations and the tariff marketplace and nearshoring and other things like that, all the words that we like to talk about when we talk about what affects transportation, whether it's that stuff or just the fact that, you know what, I'm not going to be able to go to my core carrier base and just
Right.
ask for a couple of percentage points this year.
Right.
The risk of sticking with that old model is really about speed to value and whether we can get that cost out on a more continuous basis throughout the year rather than doing a once a year event and kind of
Yep.
letting it roll.
Yep, makes sense. Okay, Steve, let's take a look at what this looks like, right? What does moving faster on costs look like in practice? Are there any specific processes, data, or organizational changes that separate the leaders from the laggards here?
Yeah, we're seeing that ability to move fast and to act in 30 to 45 days, not taking a full quarter, even half a year to implement changes.
Yeah.
That shows up, targeting specific regions or modes or those seasonal areas, looking at lanes on a regular basis that may need to go back out to market for a change, keeping an eye on your spot strategy, keeping an eye on the lanes that have been created or the new customer lanes that are showing up that you've got to take action on, and doing that in a much more targeted, systemic way.
Yeah.
Whether it's for carrier swaps, making changes on lanes, targeting specific surcharges or accessorials, making sure that you're not having to reinvent the process every time you need to make a change to your route guide or something else.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Now, Stephen, you're working with clients, you're working with shippers here. What do you typically see, when that's happening? Do you typically see some friction inside shipper organizations when they're trying to move more quickly on costs? Does it revolve around tools, data, governance, decisions? Where's that friction tend to be?
Yeah, obviously every shipper is going to be a little different, and so
Right.
some have data issues, some have tooling issues, but where we see the most friction is really around governance,
Yeah.
particularly
Got
with the
it.
larger shippers. If there's a procurement organization or a transportation and logistics organization that have, depending on their working relationship, it can really slow things down. And
Yeah.
being able to delegate the authority so that you don't have to have multiple handoffs and approvals when it's time to take action is really important.
Right. Right. Now, Steve, what role do you play in try to smooth that out? I'm sure you probably get involved there a little bit, or when you see
Uh,
those frictions, do you jump in, or how does that work?
So for me and for our organization, we really are about trying to reduce that friction and
Yeah.
trying to make sure that we've got appropriate controls in place so that folks can feel confident that the right actions are being taken without needing to have the microscope on every decision that gets
Yeah.
made. We've seen this play out, hundreds, thousands of times
Sure.
with hundreds of shippers. And we've got best practices that we can deliver to these organizations and say, hey, are there opportunities for you to improve the way that this information flows and the way that these decisions get made to speed up the value delivery to your organization?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Steve, we mentioned, flexibility, right? That's a word that gets kicked around a lot these days, flexibility and agility, it's a lot of, it's happening on the buzzword level right now, right? We're all hearing about
Yeah.
it. But what does it actually mean, to turn flexibility into a KPI inside a transportation organization? What does that look like and feel like when it's really happening?
I think it's a really good question.
Yeah.
The key here is to take it from kind of buzzword into something that can be measured. It's a KPI.
Hmm.
How long does it actually take to affect change? How long does it take to change a carrier in a lane? How long does it take to adjust a routing guide, to shift a mode on a lane?
Yeah.
The folks that are really pulling ahead and they're going to be successful with this are the ones that are doing those analyses to say, how long from the time that I recognize that I need to make a change until that change is actually implemented does it take? And what can I do to take steps out of that process and speed it up?
Right, right. Makes a lot of sense. And Steve, I mean, you've been watching this market very closely. We know, capacity is going to tighten, right? And as capacity quietly tightens here, how should shippers be rethinking sort of that broker asset mix, routing guides and carrier strategies working forward here? Because we're probably going to be seeing that capacity tighten fairly soon.
So I think the key really is making sure that we're all on the same page. The last couple of years is not a new normal. That this is a cyclical business.
Yeah.
Transportation and logistics runs in cycles, and there's going to be change, as you mentioned. We're looking at the mode mix. The best shippers are looking at what's the mix of taking what worked in the past and then mixing in new or faster changes that need to happen.
Yeah.
Making changes to routing guides as living tools, not static lists, and
Yep.
then looking at that access to capacity through platforms and partners also becomes really important. If the market The market is going to tighten likely regionally first, and so we'll start to see spikes in areas where we're running out of trucks, and we're gonna need to go into a different procurement mode or model. And when that happens, we need to have partners that are capable of bringing in that additional capacity that we need in those moments, or we're going to miss on service, or we're going to overspend. It's going to be
Yeah.
one or the other.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. See, we've talked about this term of, shipper of choice over the
Mhm.
years, right? And it seems like now is probably, we preach it in the pages of logistics management. We always say now is the time to get ready and become that true shipper of choice. Now, as exits and insurance costs and regulatory uncertainty, continue to reshape supply, what does that look like in practical terms for shippers? What does that look like to be the shipper of choice? I think you described some of it there, but can you be a little bit more specific on what that looks like for our readers?
Yeah, I think that the basics that have been talked about for years still
Right.
matter. That reasonable dwell, predictable appointments, clear communication. The big difference is the consequence. When capacity gets tight, shipper of choice becomes a larger evaluation criteria for carriers when they're
Yep.
thinking about who they want to haul for. You've got to ask the hard question of yourself. If carriers had options, would they pick us?
Right.
And if the answer isn't yes, then you really need to get specific about things you can change to turn that into a strong yes that carriers want to do business with you.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Now we have a few minutes left, Steve. Let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about design and freight pattern shifts a little bit. Freight patterns are evolving towards shorter hauls, smaller shipments, more LTL and final mile, of course. You're seeing that. How is that changing network design and transportation strategy heading into 2026?
Yeah, I think that fragmentation of freight is a very real thing. SKU diversification adds to that with a lot of our CPG shippers and others, and we are seeing more freight in LTL shipment sizes and shared capacity modes, which is a critical aspect of most of our shipper supply
Yep.
chains.
Yep.
Networks in the past that were designed around these big regional DCs and kind of long trunk moves to truckload moves into major retailers or major customers are being asked to really be quicker, be more
Yep.
nimble,
Yep.
and smaller, more frequent flows. It puts pressure on that
Yep.
mode mix and service models and how networks are orchestrated, because you've got to be thinking about cost, lead time, and your ongoing service deliverables.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt, Steve. And you're seeing this quite a bit, obviously, from our conversation today. You're watching a lot of your shipper customers. What mistakes do you tend to see shippers make when they try to adopt to these shifts, right? Especially around mode mix and service expectations. What are some of those sort of biggest challenges or mistakes you see them make in the most cases?
Yeah, I think one of the bigger things is they think of it just as a strictly rate problem instead of
Yeah.
thinking about their structure.
Right, right.
Pushing on traditional strategies harder, forcing new freight into an old mode or an old model, that can really start to create some service issues. It can expose gaps or shortfalls in your planning process pretty quickly.
Yeah.
The folks that are doing this really well are looking for partners that are bringing a new capability into their network, where they can see across modes. They can manage them as one holistic network, instead of these kind of disconnected systems or decisions that are being made within the network itself.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, Steve, we do have just a couple minutes left, and I do want to touch on one of those challenges you mentioned before. You called out the internal governance and slow decision making as those maybe not so much hidden anymore, but true bottlenecks happening inside a
Yeah.
lot of shipper organizations. Where do these bottlenecks tend to show up the most inside of most shipper organizations when you're working with them, or when you begin to work with them?
Yeah, it's decision latency, decision paralysis in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
Changes that ought to take hours end up taking weeks or even
Yeah.
longer. Order patterns shift and they show up clearly in the transportation data, but it can take a quarter or more for changes to actually move through the process to get carriers in place, lanes set up, the commercial teams, procurement, everybody working together.
Yeah.
The organization can see the problem. We work with shippers that have very long contracting cycles, and it makes it very difficult to bring in new capacity when they need it. They can
Yeah.
see that problem, but they just can't respond at the speed that they need to in order to
Right.
meet the business need.
Yeah. Makes sense, Steve. Now, for those logistics organizations and operations, listening today, what would you say, what's one governance or decision-making change they could like realistically make in the next, say, 90 days to move faster on cost and flexibility?
So not necessarily a change, but an action that they could absolutely take is something I mentioned before. Map out how long those common transportation decisions actually take. Map them out end to end. Figure out where the handoffs are, where handoffs are adding value, and kind of where they just add the delay. And then target that one area in your process that looks like the opportunity to eliminate the most time in that cycle, and see how short you can get the cycle time down. Review it regularly. Make sure that any changes you're making are sticking, and see if there's other opportunities to continue to shorten it so that you can move that process into a shorter and shorter time frame.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And a great way, as we move into this quick wrap up, Steve, we are kind of up against the clock. But, Steve, just as we wrap up here, if you had to give transportation and supply chain leaders maybe one or two sort of playbook updates, that they could bring back to their teams today to start strategizing for 2026, what would those be?
I think the big ones that I'd mentioned are treat that cost out process as a continuous and fast, not episodic and slow. And then start measuring your agility the same way that you measure cost and service. If you've got KPI dashboards for cost and service, you should have one for your most common processes and measure how long it takes to get things done.
Yep, makes a lot of sense. Well, Steve Barber, Vice President of Solutions Architecture at Uber Freight. Steve, great job, and thank you so much for joining me today. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks for the conversation, Michael.
Absolutely. Terrific job. Thank you so much. And again, thanks to Uber Freight for making this terrific conversation possible. Thanks again, everybody, and have a terrific day.